in case you're curious, this arrow syntax, it comes more from C. Come the next example that I give, you will not be using this arrow syntax. But what it is, so we're treating Alice sort of as like a struct. And so we are dereferencing that struct and then accessing the age field inside of that struct. So arrow is equivalent to star Alice dot. This is just a very disgusting syntax, and so that's why they give us arrow. Arrow just means here is a pointer to a struct/object, and go to that object and change this field at that object. But you will not be using arrows on objects ever. So this is a pretty bad example, but this is our intro example. Do the same thing with Bob. We allocate him, we give him an age, we give him a name. And then greet down here, we're going to nslog, and we see nslog, and we need to pass nslog and nsstring as its first argument. And so we see our normal %d over here, and sage is just, as we saw in the student.h file, sage is just an int, and so that's fine. And sname was an ns string, and so the nslog version of like %s for ns strings is going to be this %at. So that is the flag for printing ns strings. Actually running this, so up top, hitting build or run, I forget the shortcut for it, and down here we see the nslog output. Hello Alice, you're 20. Hi Bob, you're 21. Questions on this simple example? Because it's going to be changing pretty substantially in the next example. Yeah, so this is also what I kind of paused at before because I didn't want to say quite yet. Student star. Student is really like Alice is the object, but like pretty much read student star. Don't read that as a pointer to a student. Just take student star to be like the type of the object. So you will never really be dealing with a student Alice. You will always be dealing with a student star Alice. And in the next example, going to students 2. No, not really. Okay, so in this example, let's look at .h first. So now, this is the same. It's inheriting from NSObject. We have changed this. We're no longer saying int age and NSstring name. We're saying underscore age and underscore name. And that is a convention that in the past it used to just be a convention, and now it's a convention that actually means something. So you're going to want to pretty much always have these instance variables be underscored. And now here we're getting to these strange looking method things. So let's actually go back to slides for a second. We'll see in a second why we want the underscores. I haven't quite gotten there yet. Okay, so instance variables, we saw we can have them at protected, at private, at public. And it's somewhat messy, but like when I said at public, everything beneath the at public would be public. But then if I switch to, like if I had at public int x, then at private int y, y would be private because it's underneath the private. Okay, so first let's look at this. So messages. In other object-oriented languages, you don't really, well, some you do, but Java you don't. So messages are going to be the way that we invoke methods on objects and classes. So here, this square bracket syntax is what you're going to be using to send messages. And here we're saying the student class has a method called alloc And so send to the student class that method, invoke that method, and then that is supposed to return a student star. And so this alloc is going to be pretty much everywhere. Whenever you need to allocate an object, you need to do some sort of alloc. Sometimes there's like alloc. Sometimes there are some other alloc type functions you might be using, but you're almost always going to be allocing these things. So here, there are two different types of methods, like there are in other object-oriented languages. So we have instance methods and class methods. And so the way we're going to differentiate between those is all the way on the left side, you see we have this minus sign. So if we have a minus sign, that means the method is going to be an instance method. And if we have a plus sign, that means that it's going to be a class method. And an instance method is something that you actually need an object to use the method. And a class method is something where you don't need an object to use the method. So going back to here, the fact that we're calling alloc on the student class tells us that alloc is a class method because we don't actually need a student to allocate a student. That'd be pretty flawed if we couldn't actually get a student without having a student.
So if you have a plus sign, then it's like a static method?
Yes. So yeah, the static keyword from Java is the equivalent of plus. So the syntax for these things, we see all the way on the left is going to go plus or minus, always. And then we're going to have the return type of the method. So here we have void, int, void. Then after the return type, we have the name of the method. And so we have the name init, and we have the name age. And then technically the name of the last method is going to be setAge:. We'll see why. But this age is what we're just going to call that variable, and this is the type of that variable. So this method isn't going to return anything. It's called setAge:, and we would pass it some integer. So sending those messages, we see that student, we're using lowercase student, so this student over here, this student object. Since these are instance methods, we need to send these messages to objects. So we send the init message to student, we send the age message to student, and then we send setAge with the parameter 20, with the argument 20. Questions? What do you mean?
Like if I want to call the init method on student, I can call it like that, I guess?
Yes. That is how you should call it.
And could I also call it C star?
Could you call it as what?
Like I would in C.
How would you call it in C?
Like I would say student and then dash.
So no. This is why the previous example was something that was bad. You should very rarely be dereferencing objects. I almost want to say never dereference objects. And so the arrow operator is an implicit dereference. And so init is also somewhat different from setting the fields of the object. And another reason why the previous example was bad. You never want to deal with an object that was allocated but not initialized. So even though the student object, and we'll see in the next example how I originally just had like student alloc, and then I did Alice arrow age. I shouldn't have done that. I should have done student alloc init. So always initialize your objects, and then I could access those fields. But then on top of that, I shouldn't be accessing those fields using arrows. I should be sending messages. So we'll see that in the next example, the right way of doing that. And then we'll see that there are like 10 newer right ways of doing it. So selectors, pretty much an alternative name for method. So alloc, init, age, and setAge:. Remember, the colon is part of the name. Once we see multiple argument functions, we'll see that there will be multiple colons in the name. So all of those are just selectors, and we'll see why that's relevant later. And let's look at that example now. So student 2. OK. So here we have said int underscore age and underscore name. And now we have 4 methods. And this is like the getters